The first time David Thorne saw her, she wasn't protesting, she wasn't shouting, and she certainly wasn't reading a zoning ordinance. She was simply wading, ankle-deep in the shallows where his dock began, the exact spot David considered the sacred boundary of his family's peace. It was mid-July, the heat a thick, oppressive blanket over the North Woods. Ember Lake, usually a shimmering cobalt mirror, was his sanctuary. He stood on the deck of the cedar and stone cabin he and his wife, Sarah, had spent 3 decades building, sipping lukewarm coffee and watching the morning mist burn off the water. The view, unobstructed and wholly private, was the reward for a life of grueling city work. It was the inheritance he was cultivating for his daughter, Chloe. Then he saw the woman. She was dressed in a simple white linen shift, and her hair, the color of wet sand, was braided down her back. She wasn't looking at the cabin. She was looking down into the water, her posture serene, almost reverent. David put the mug down, the ceramic clattering against the railing. This wasn't a lost hiker. This was a presence. He descended the 42 steps of the dock access, his sandals crunching loudly on the gravel path. By the time he reached the final timber riser, the peaceful morning had evaporated, replaced by a sudden hot spike of territorial anger. "Can I help you?" His voice was firm, laced with the polite but unmistakable authority of an owner. The woman slowly lifted her head. She was older than he first thought, maybe mid-50s, with eyes the color of pale lake stone. She didn't flinch, didn't apologize, and didn't attempt to step back onto public access land, which David knew was a quarter-mile down the shore. "David Thorne," she said, her voice low and utterly devoid of question. "I've been waiting for you." David stopped dead. The familiarity was immediately unsettling. "I don't know who you are." "This is private property. Ember Lake Estates, Lot C4. You are trespassing." She smiled, a small, sad movement that didn't reach her eyes. She finally lifted her gaze from the water to look at his house, then back at him. "The property line is where the land ends, yes. But the water, David, the water is not yours." "That's absurd," David scoffed, already feeling defensive. "The lake is entirely enclosed by private land, including my property, which extends 20 feet past the water's edge based on the 1993 survey. I own the riparian rights, the shoreline, and the land beneath. Now I'm asking you to leave before I call the county sheriff." "You own the dirt," the woman corrected, her tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. She finally took a step back, emerging from the water. David noticed the ground around her feet was curiously dry, almost dusty, despite the damp sand of the shoreline. "My name is Alara, and I represent the original claim." "The original claim?" David almost laughed, but the seriousness in her eyes stopped him. "The original claim was filed by the Tilden family in 1912, and it passed to the developer and then to me. I have the title insurance, the deed, the whole chain of custody. What exactly are you claiming?" Alara didn't answer with documents or legal jargon. She gestured with an open hand toward the wide, glittering expanse of the lake. "I claim the depth, the breath, the things that sleep beneath the silt." David rubbed his temples. This was either a sophisticated high-stakes prank or he was dealing with someone deeply unstable. "Look, Alara, I'm giving you 1 minute to walk down the shore and off my property. This isn't a game." "It's the oldest game there is," she murmured. She began to walk away. Not quickly, but with a confident, measured pace that infuriated David more than a full sprint would have. "I'll see you in court," David shouted after her. Alara paused about 20 feet away near the boundary markers of his neighbor, the notoriously absentee Miller family. She didn't turn around. "You will, David, but I won't be suing you for the land. I'll be suing you for the water that you steal from me every time you launch your boat." The incident should have ended there, dismissed as the rantings of a solitary, eccentric woman, but Alara was true to her word. 2 weeks later, a courier delivered a thick manila envelope, sealed with a notary stamp and addressed directly to David Thorne. It was a cease and desist order, followed by a formal petition for injunction. The filing wasn't from a conventional law firm. It was from a small boutique practice known for environmental and tribal law, based 3 states away. The case name, Alara Thorne, alleged unlawful interference with prior established common water rights and cultural custodianship of ancestral water. David, a successful but wholly terrestrial corporate lawyer, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He hired the best local property attorney, Marcus Vane. Marcus, a big man with a reassuringly pragmatic drawl, spread the documents across David's massive oak dining table. Sarah hovered anxiously near the kitchen, making a third pot of coffee. "It's junk, David," Marcus declared, tapping a manicured finger on a section of Alara's filing. "Absolute junk. They cite a 19th century treaty concerning the sacred waters of the unnamed and a local ordinance that was overturned in '88. I'll file a motion to dismiss within 48 hours. She's got no standing. Then why the specialist firm?" Sarah asked quietly from the doorway. "Why travel 3 states? People don't hire environmental specialists for frivolous property claims." "To spook us, Sarah," David said, forcing a smile that felt brittle. "To drive up the legal fees and hope we settle to get her out of our hair. She wants cash, or she wants to fish off my dock. That's it." "She didn't ask for money," Sarah pointed out. "She asked you to stop using the water. She wants to claim it." David ignored his wife's unnerving intuition and focused on the lawyer. "Marcus, I want this shut down. I don't want to settle a cent. If this woman establishes any legal precedent, the value of every lot on this lake tanks. You understand? This is a war for the entire community." "Understood. I'll bury her in paper," Marcus promised, gathering his files. "She won't know what hit her." But Alara fought back with an unsettling agility that defied Marcus's prediction. She didn't just counter his motions. She introduced motions David had never encountered: petitions for historical geological review, requests for discovery on pre-colonial land use, and an immediate demand for the Thorns water testing records, citing environmental contamination. "She's using the legal system like a geological survey team," David complained to Sarah 3 weeks later, pacing the deck. The motion to dismiss had failed. They were headed to a preliminary hearing. "It's not about ownership. It's about making our life hell until we abandon the lake." "She said the water owns her, David," Sarah said softly, watching the twilight settle over the water. "She's not looking at your deed. She's looking at the history of this place." David stopped pacing. "Fine, then we'll look at the history too. We'll show the judge what this land is. A profitable, modern development, not some ancient shrine." That night, David, unable to sleep, went down to his dusty, neglected utility shed near the water's edge. He was searching for the original 1993 survey markers, the iron rods that proved his claim to the dirt, but his eyes caught an old, rotting plywood box tucked high on a shelf. Inside, wrapped in yellowed plastic, was a collection of relics left by the previous owner, a reclusive historian named Mr. Silas, who had died in the cabin. Most of the box contained faded photos of fishing trips and old lures. But at the very bottom, beneath a layer of moldy newspaper, David found a thin, leather-bound journal. It was brittle, smelling of damp earth and smoke. With the initials ST embossed on the cover, Silas Tilden, the original 1912 claimant, David carried it back inside, his hands trembling slightly, a rare sensation for the always composed man. He opened it carefully to a random page. The spidery, ink-faded script was hard to read, but a passage on a brittle, half-torn sheet caught his attention. November 12, 1913. "The lake resists the name. They call it Tilden's Pond, but that is a lie. She, the true watcher, demands the old language. The markers are set too low. They are in the water. We built the cabin on the wrong spot. Every surveyor knows. A lake belongs to the basin that created it, and the basin here is restless." David flipped to the first page. It was a title, written in bold, frantic strokes. "The True History of Ember Lake, Volume 1, The Cost of the Claim." He skipped ahead, his heart hammering against his ribs, until he found a hand-drawn map. It was a crudely sketched outline of the lake, but instead of marking his familiar Lot C4, it marked a single massive area labeled the First Concession, centered directly over the deepest part of the lake. Beneath the title was a note: the surveyors did not find the stone. They mistook the boundary for the shore. The true boundary is underwater, and the boundary marker is the ember stone, a relic of the first people. If the stone is found, the deed is null. David felt the blood drain from his face. His lawyer said Alara's claims were based on junk treaties. But here, in the handwriting of the man who first owned the lake, was the foundation of her entire defense, a physical, specific condition that could nullify his deed. He slammed the journal shut. This changed everything. This wasn't a frivolous claim for money. This was a quest for something buried, something ancient. He had to discredit her claim before she found this ember stone. He opened the journal again, desperate to find the page that explained where the stone was hidden. He found a final, hastily scribbled entry on the last page. It was dated 1915, written The metallic ping, 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 vibrating from 50 feet out, felt less like a distant sound and more like a drill, boring directly into David Thorne's sanity. It was rhythmic, steady, and utterly audacious. Alara wasn't just claiming the water. She was actively plundering his property's hidden history, and she was doing it right now, in the dead of night, while he stood helpless on his dock. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through David's shock. He had a brief, irrational thought of grabbing a fishing gaff and wading out, but the final, terrifying line from the journal, "Only the rightful heir can access the stone now," and the rightful heir is beneath the surface, stopped him. He was a corporate litigator, not a deep-sea diver, and certainly not a protagonist in some forgotten folklore. He snatched the leather journal off the deck. He had to assume Alara didn't have this. This was his leverage, his secret weapon, and his doom. He spun around and sprinted back up the 42 steps, the old wood groaning under his weight. He burst into the cabin, where Sarah was asleep, the moonlight casting a gentle silver square across their bed. Sarah. "Sarah, wake up!" "She's out there." "She's diving." Sarah blinked, disoriented. "Who? What are you talking about, David?" "Alara. She's in the water, right over the concession area using a detector. She's searching for the ember stone, the one Silas wrote about." He threw the journal onto the duvet. "Read it. This whole deed is a lie, Sarah, a conditional lie based on whether a rock is found." Sarah sat up, her eyes wide, the journal glowing eerily in the moonlight. "She's actually diving now?" "We need to call the police, David. This is illegal entry, breaking and entering." "No," David said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He was thinking like a lawyer now, cynical and calculating. If the sheriff finds her, they just charge her with a misdemeanor. She pays a fine and comes back tomorrow. But if they find this, he tapped the journal, and she successfully files a motion of discovery on it, then the whole lake becomes evidence. Every deed, every mortgage, every property value collapses. I can't risk it. We have to beat her to the stone." "Beat her?" Sarah echoed, her eyes traveling from the journal to the dark window. "How, David? Do you have scuba gear? She's got the jump on us." David walked to the window, his gaze fixed on the spot where the pinging continued, a slow, patient hunt in the subterranean silence. "I don't need gear. I need to disrupt the search. If she can't find it tonight, I buy us time until the hearing. She said the lake is bound to the family of the land. The stone is right under where our old pontoon mooring used to be, over the deepest point." He grabbed the heavy-duty floodlight from the hall closet and rushed out. Sarah followed, pulling on a robe, her face pale with dread. "David, don't do anything rash. You're not thinking straight." He ignored her. On the dock, he located the heavy, galvanized anchor chain they used to secure the boat during winter storms. It was 20 feet of solid, unforgiving steel. David pulled the massive knot free, the chain rattling like bones. "I'm going to make some noise. I'm going to make it too dangerous to stay down there." He dragged the heavy chain to the end of the dock. The pinging was almost constant now, closer to the surface, suggesting Alara was narrowing her search grid. "She's directly under the first concession." "Sarah," David grunted, positioning the chain over the water. "If I drop this, it'll stir up the silt for 100 yards. She won't see anything for a week. Or it'll hit her," Sarah pleaded, grabbing his arm. "David, you could kill her! You could go to prison for this! She's trying to steal our home." He tore his arm free. "She's using century-old tribal voodoo to steal our inheritance." This is war, Sarah, and I am not losing. With a desperate, adrenalized roar, David heaved the heavy anchor chain over the railing. The effect was instantaneous and deafening. The chain hit the water with a tremendous, churning crash, followed by a deep, metallic thud as it settled on the soft lake bottom. The pinging stopped. Silence. A profound, suffocating silence descended on Ember Lake. David stood rigid, breathing heavily, peering into the dark water, waiting for a head to surface, a shout of pain, anything. Then, 50 feet away, a powerful surge of bubbles erupted. A figure burst from the water, dragging herself across the surface toward the deep water marker buoy. It was Ilara. She wasn't injured, but she was furious. "Thorn!" she shrieked, her voice echoing unnaturally across the quiet cove. "You have crossed a line you cannot uncross." "Get off my property," David yelled back, his voice ragged. "I've called the county sheriff. The next sound you hear will be a police siren." He hadn't called the police, but the lie felt necessary. Ilara stabilized herself near the buoy. She lifted her hand. David could see the dim glint of the metal detector in her grasp. Then, with a cold, deliberate motion, she plunged the detector back under the water and let it go. It sank silently. "I don't need the metal detector, David," she called, her voice now calm, chillingly so. "You just told me where the Emberstone is. Thank you for the depth charge." She turned and began swimming strongly toward the Miller's shoreline, disappearing into the heavy shadows of the pine trees lining the neighbor's neglected lot. David stood there, staring at the ripple marks left by her passing. He had risked everything, potentially committed a felony, and all he had done was confirm the stone's location. The next morning, the preliminary injunction hearing was a disaster. David had spent the remainder of the night scouring the journal for more clues, but it was just a patchwork of frantic entries about moving iron pins and the restless basin. He hadn't slept, and the tension had aged him 5 years in 12 hours. Marcus Vane, David's attorney, had promised a surgical strike, arguing the legal principle of ad coelum, that the owner of the land owns everything from the heavens above to the center of the earth below. But Ilara's lawyer, a sharp, composed woman named Anya Sharma, dismantled him with terrifying ease. "Your Honor," Anya began, standing before Judge Hayes, a man known for his rigid adherence to property law. "My client is not disputing the modern deed to Lot C4. We are challenging the original basis of that deed, which we assert was fraudulently established by the initial claimant, Silas Tilden, in 1915. To convert public trust water into private riparian land." Marcus jumped to his feet. "Objection, hearsay. Speculation!" "This is an environmental activist masquerading as a land rights litigant, Your Honor. The Tilden family claim has been adjudicated, recorded, and transferred multiple times." "The Thorn deed is ironclad." "Is it?" Anya asked, turning slowly to face David. "Mr. Thorn, can you confirm that Lot C4's property line extends 20 feet past the shoreline, into the lake itself, based on the 1993 survey?" David, sworn in, answered stiffly, "Yes, that is correct." "And can you confirm that the previous owner, Silas Tilden, was a known historian and amateur geologist of the region?" "I don't know the man's resume, but yes, he was the original claimant," David snapped. Anya then introduced her first exhibit, a grainy, black-and-white photograph of an iron survey pin, half submerged in water, taken in 1914. "Exhibit A," Anya stated calmly. This photograph, verified by 3 independent historians, shows Silas Tilden's original survey pin set in 1914. The pin is clearly submerged. Furthermore, my expert, Dr. Lennox, will testify that due to a known geological shift in 1917, the lake level dropped by nearly 30 inches, meaning the 1914 pin was submerged by over a foot of water. She paused, letting the implication settle. "The law is clear, Your Honor. Land boundaries cannot be established in navigable water. The law dictates that a claim made in the water is a null claim. Silas Tilden knew this, which is why he moved the boundary pins after the lake level dropped, a fraudulent act, and created the lie that Mr. Thorn's deed is founded upon." Marcus was reeling. "This is circumstantial historical nonsense. The 1993 survey corrected the location of the modern pins." "The 1993 survey," Anya countered, her voice rising with dramatic clarity, merely surveyed the location of the fraudulently moved pins. Your Honor, the fundamental question is, did the lake basin itself ever legally become private land? We assert it did not. She turned to Judge Hayes. We are asking for a temporary injunction on Mr. Thorne's use of the lake water, including the operation of his boat, until we can complete a subsurface survey of the first concession. The area where Silas Tilden's own private journal indicates the true, original, and binding boundary marker, the Emberstone, is located. David's heart seized. Her own private journal. Elara had never seen the journal David found, yet she knew the name Emberstone and the term first concession. It meant the information wasn't a family secret. It was part of an oral tradition or another parallel document. Judge Hayes leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. Ms. Sharma, while your historical argument is compelling, I cannot stop a homeowner from using his property based on a legendary stone. You need contemporary, non-circumstantial proof of a claim. Do you have physical evidence that the 1914 pins were the final boundary, or are we relying on a pre-war photograph? Anya smiled. It was the same small, confident, and unsettling smile Elara had given David on his dock. We do, Your Honor, Anya said, her voice dropping to a theatrical hush. We were prepared to introduce it as Exhibit B this afternoon. However, last night, due to an unprovoked attack on my client in the dark hours, the physical evidence was contaminated. David felt. The silence of Ember Lake had become David Thorne's personal torment. Before the TRO, silence meant peace. Now it was merely the absence of the noise he was forbidden to make, broken only by the cold, metallic whine of Elara's side-scan sonar. It was day 5 of the 14-day injunction. David had descended from a corporate titan to a twitchy, unshaven sentinel. He spent his hours on the deck with a pair of high-powered binoculars and a telephoto camera, documenting every movement made by the 2 professional divers and Elara's stern-faced attorney, Anya Sharma, who now supervised the excavation from a chartered pontoon anchored 50 feet from his dock. They're treating my lake like an archaeological dig, David muttered into the lens, watching the divers attach flotation bags to a large, indistinct object on the lake floor. He hadn't spoken to Sarah since her midnight departure. His coffee was cold. His composure colder. The community had noticed. The small, close-knit circle of homeowners on Ember Lake Estates, the people who had shared barbecues and dock space for decades, were now looking at David with a mixture of pity and resentment. His impulsive illegal action had brought unwanted judicial scrutiny to their quiet sanctuary. The Millers, his immediate neighbors whose shoreline was now Elara's base of operations, were conspicuously silent, refusing to return David's increasingly frantic phone calls. David watched as Elara, standing on the deck of the Millers' neglected pier, pointed an imperious finger toward the sonar screen. The divers immediately descended again. They were deep in the first concession, the alleged ancient basin. 300 miles away, Sarah Thorne was drowning in paper. The county archives was a mausoleum of forgotten history, smelling of dust, formaldehyde, and stale ambition. Sarah, using David's legal contacts, had managed to pull the long-sealed personal records of Silas Tilden, the original 1912 claimant. She was searching for a letter, any mention of a second hiding spot for the deed's true condition, a piece of leverage Silas may have intended to pass to his family. Hours melted into a chaotic blur of land transfer forms, probate filings, and receipts for geological equipment. Silas Tilden, it turned out, was not just a historian. He was obsessively paranoid, filing documents under multiple aliases and using antiquated forms of encryption. I need to know what he hid after he moved the pins, Sarah explained, rubbing her tired eyes to the overwhelmed archivist. He admitted the deed was a lie. He must have left a key. After nearly 2 days of fruitless searching, right as the archive was about to close, Sarah found a slim, red ribbon-tied folder labeled, simply, Daughter's Inheritance. Inside were not legal documents, but a series of cryptic letters written in 1917, addressed to Clementine. The final letter, dated just before Silas's death, contained the breakthrough. My dearest Clem, they will look for the stone beneath the silt, where the water is oldest. But the stone is a distraction. The real boundary is built into the new home, into the very bones of the land I claimed for us. They will search for iron, but the true marker is made of cedar and glass. I named the child after the lake, Clementine Ember Tilden. If, after my death, any claimant of the water attempts to use the ember stone to nullify the deed, then the counterclaim must be read from the Tilden window, which overlooks the deepest part of the cove. This is the second concession, not of the water, but of the light. Only when the light hits the window on the summer solstice and the air reads the counterclaim aloud is the deed made permanently whole. The counterclaim is not written down, my dear. It is a name. The name of the first child born on the land, who carries the blood of the lake and the right of the land. Tell no one. Guard the name. Sarah stared at the passage. The Tilden window. She knew exactly which window Silas meant. The massive, original bay window in their living room facing the lake, which David had often complained was structurally unnecessary. Silas hadn't just moved a pin. He had embedded a legal condition into the very architecture of the cabin. But what was the counterclaim? A name. The name of the first child born on the land. The only first child David and Sarah knew was Chloe, their daughter. But Silas's daughter, Clementine, was the first Tilden child. Sarah grabbed her phone, her hands shaking, adrenaline flooding her system. She had to get back. She had to figure out what name she needed to read and find some kind of documentation connecting the Tilden lineage to the Thorns. Back at the lake, David was watching through his binoculars when the action intensified. The divers surfaced, the two men struggling to haul a heavy object onto the pontoon deck. It was a dark, jagged rock, roughly the size of a human head, covered in a thick layer of prehistoric lake silt. Ilara's attorney, Anya Sharma, rushed forward with a brush and a flask of water. She began cleaning the rock meticulously. As the silt washed away, a faint, reddish-gray glint appeared, followed by a series of strange, shallow carvings, symbols that looked vaguely runic. It was the Ember Stone. Ilara had found the legendary physical evidence that, according to Silas Tilden's original intent, nullified the deed. Ilara dropped to her knees beside the stone, touching the carvings with an emotion that transcended legal victory. It was religious fervor. She looked up, her pale eyes locking onto David, who was a motionless silhouette on his far-off deck. She didn't raise her fist or shout. She simply held up her phone, photographing the stone, before turning her back to him. The next move would be a motion filed with Judge Hayes demanding immediate, permanent cessation of the Thorns' property rights. David collapsed into his deck chair, the binoculars dangling forgotten around his neck. It was over. The 14 days hadn't even passed, and Ilara had won the entire lake. Just then, his phone buzzed, an incoming call from Sarah, the signal weak and frantic. Sarah! They found it! They have the stone! It's done! No, listen to me, David, listen. It's not the stone that matters, it's the window. Sarah's voice was breaking up, overlaid with the sound of wind rushing past a car window. Silas wrote a counterclaim. The Tilden window, facing the lake. You have to find the name of the first child born on that land. What are you talking about? Clementine? No! That's the key. Silas had a son first, David. He had a son who died in 1915, a month after the pin was moved. But I found the birth certificate. His name was Ember Tilden. Silas named him after the lake, but he died. Silas thought he was cursed, and that the only way to appease the lake was to leave the water claim conditional. David's mind raced. If Silas's son was named Ember Tilden, he had named his child after the lake, not the other way around. But the name didn't matter. What was the shock? Why is this the counterclaim, Sarah? Why is that name important now? David shouted into the phone. The connection crackled violently, and Sarah's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. David! I found another file. A closed adoption record from 1958. Silas Tilden's great-granddaughter, Ilara's mother. She gave birth to a child on that land, a child she immediately gave up for adoption. David felt the lake cabin, the entire world tilt on its axis. Wait, Ilara's mother gave birth to a child on this land? Yes. The birth certificate is here, David. The child's name is Chloe. It's our daughter, David. Our Chloe! Ilara's mother gave birth to our Chloe in that cabin. Chloe is the lineal heir of Silas Tilden, the child born on the land that the counterclaim is tied to. The line went dead. The powerful beat, major turning point. Irony and shock. David stared at the phone. His blood ran cold. Ilara wasn't fighting him to take his land. She was fighting him to claim the water tied to her own lost bloodline. And the legal mechanism to save his deed, the second concession hidden in the window, was tied to his own adopted daughter, Chloe, who was unknowingly the true heiress, not of the land, but of the water that Ilara sought. At that exact moment, the massive bay window in his living room, the Tilden window, caught the final blood-red ray of the setting sun. The light pierced the glass, shining a brilliant, focused beam directly onto the worn leather cover of Silas Tilden's journal, illuminating the initials ST. The light was not just a signal, it was a deadline. The tension is now rooted in a devastating family secret, and the ultimate irony: the person who can save the land is the person who is genetically tied to the water claimant. Part 4 will need to focus on David's desperate attempt to execute the Tilden window counterclaim with Chloe. The silence in the cedar cabin was a physical weight, pressing David Thorne down into the dining chair. Chloe, his daughter, his fiercely loved adopted daughter, was the lineal heir of the very family trying to seize his home. She was the one born on the land, the key to the second concession. The knowledge, delivered by Sarah's frantic, broken voice over a dying cell signal, was a kinetic shock. It wasn't just a legal loophole. It was a devastating personal truth, a 20-year secret now weaponized against him. David looked up. The sun had dipped below the tree line on the far ridge, but the last crimson light was still piercing the massive bay window, the Tilden window in the living room. The laser-focused beam was now less than a foot from dying out entirely. The light is the deadline. He didn't have time to call Sarah back or to process the immense ethical breach of what he was about to do. He had to save the land first. He sprinted through the hallway. Chloe, 19 and home for the summer from college, was in her room, headphones on, typing furiously on her laptop, working on an application for a summer internship in city planning. She was meticulous, rational, and allergic to drama. David burst in without knocking. "Chloe, take those off, now!" Chloe jumped, yanking the oversized headphones down around her neck. Her expression was startled, instantly hardening into annoyance at her father's wild-eyed panic. "Dad, what the hell?" "I'm on a deadline. Our deadline is tonight." "Right now," David said, his voice ragged. He grabbed her laptop, slamming the lid shut. "They found the stone, Chloe. Ilara has the evidence to nullify the deed. She wins, and we lose the house." Chloe stood up, angry. "What, the rock?" But Marcus said, "Marcus was wrong. I was wrong. This whole thing is not about property lines. It's about a condition, a counterclaim hidden by the original owner, Tilden. And you are the key." He grabbed her arm, his grip hard. He dragged her toward the living room, toward the diminishing shaft of red light streaming through the Tilden window. "Dad, stop, you're scaring me!" "Let go." Chloe struggled, attempting to pull away. He didn't let go. He forced her into the living room, positioning her directly in the path of the final, glowing beam of light. "Listen to me, Chloe. You have to listen," David pleaded, dropping his voice to a desperate, urgent rasp. "Silas Tilden, the man who built this cabin, hid a failsafe. If the Emberstone is found, and it has been, Ilara has it right now, then the only way to save the deed is to read a counterclaim from this window when the sun hits it." He shoved the brittle leather journal into her hands. "The counterclaim isn't written down. It's a name, the name of the first child born on this land, who carries the blood of the lake." Chloe was breathing heavily, staring from the frantic David to the blinding crimson slice of light and then out the window, where the pontoon, laden with the dark, jagged Emberstone, was still anchored. "I don't understand, Dad. What name?" "It was Tilden's son, right? Ember Tilden. What does this have to do with me?" David gripped her shoulders, forcing her to look him in the eyes. He had no time for gradual disclosure. The light beam was flickering. He had to deliver the truth like a bullet. It has everything to do with you. Silas's counterclaim was meant for the lineal heir. Ilara is related to the Tildens, but her own mother, Silas's great-granddaughter, gave birth to a child in this cabin in 1958. He swallowed. The lie lodged in his throat, burning. That child was you, Chloe. You were born right here, and your adoptive mother and I, we are the only ones who knew until today. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Chloe's eyes, usually sharp with quick intelligence, glazed over with raw, stunned disbelief. She didn't shout. She became instantly dangerously quiet. What are you saying? Her voice was flat, hollow. I'm adopted, yes, I know that. But you're telling me my biological family is the one trying to steal our house? And my adoption is part of some century-old land claim? It's karma, it's history, I don't know what it is. David shook his head violently. All I know is that Silas's failsafe is tied to the child born here. That name, the name that saves the land, is the name of Silas's firstborn son. Ember Tilden, you have to speak it, Chloe. You have to claim the right of the land before that light is gone. Chloe recoiled from his touch, a look of profound betrayal washing over her face. You waited until the moment you were losing the house, until the exact second you needed me to save your property, to tell me my entire family history is a lie? You want me to perform a magical incantation based on a dead relative's name to save your deed? Out on the lake, the divers were packing up. Anya Sharma was on her phone, clearly relaying the success of the Emberstone recovery to Judge Hayes's clerk. The window of opportunity was closing. The light, Chloe! Look at the light! David pleaded, tears stinging his eyes. We lose everything! Your inheritance! Your home, say the name. Ember Tilden. Chloe looked out the window. She saw Ilara staring back at the cabin, her expression a mask of cold triumph, holding the dark stone to the fading light like a scepter. Chloe saw the desperation in her father's face and the immense weight of the secret he had just dumped on her. The crimson light was now only a sliver, crossing the carpet, racing toward the baseboard. With a look of glacial fury aimed not at Ilara, but at David, Chloe lifted the journal. She held it steady in the last rays of sun. She took a ragged breath and, speaking with clear, cold contempt, she declared, I am the lineal heir, born on the land. I speak the counterclaim. The name is... The light died. In the fraction of a second before total shadow swallowed the room, Chloe whispered the name. Ember Tilden. The effect was instantaneous and violent. But it happened outside, out on the pontoon. Where Ilara stood holding the emberstone, the water did not ripple or surge. Instead, a sound like glass shattering emanated from beneath the lake's surface. The pontoon, which had been perfectly stable, began to list violently. The two divers screamed as the heavy-duty side-scan sonar, still attached to its tripod beneath the boat, was suddenly and violently wrenched downward. What's happening? Anya Sharma shrieked, scrambling for the life vests. Ilara, however, did not move. She stared at the cabin. She knew exactly what had happened. The second concession had been claimed. Her right to the water, earned by the stone, had been instantly countered by the right of the land, spoken by the bloodline. The lake, which had been steadily giving up its secrets for Ilara, suddenly recoiled. The dark, muddy emberstone in Ilara's hand began to grow unnervingly hot. The carvings on its surface glowed briefly with a pale, subterranean green light, before the stone shattered, fragmenting into 1,000 pieces of common black basalt. The physical evidence of her claim was vaporized. The pontoon, now listing dangerously, was pulled toward the shoreline of the Miller property. The force that had ripped the sonar away continued to act on the entire vessel, dragging it over the shallows with irresistible speed. Within seconds, the pontoon, the divers, Anya Sharma, and Ilara were slammed hard against the shoreline, scraping to a grinding halt on the dry gravel of the Miller's lot, well above the waterline. They were stuck, high and dry, grounded on the land they had sought to reclaim as water. In the living room, David stared out the window at the chaos he had just unleashed. The boat was immobilized on the shore, the legal team trapped and soaked. The Emberstone was destroyed. He had won the legal battle, at least for now, He turned back to Chloe, elated, exhausted, and desperately relieved. "It worked, Chloe. You did it. We're safe." Chloe looked at him. Her face was cold, utterly devoid of warmth. She dropped the journal onto the floor and stepped back, away from the light, away from him. "We lost a lot more than a deed, Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking with fury and hurt. "You lied to me. For years. You saved the house, but you didn't save your family." Chloe turned and walked out, leaving David alone in the darkness. The powerful beat, major. Turning point, karmic and emotional consequence. David stood in the pitch-black living room, the throbbing silence of the lake now deafening. He had saved the land, but he had shattered the trust with his daughter. He had no time to mourn the damage. A new sound, subtle but menacing, caught his attention. It wasn't Alara, and it wasn't the lake. It was the front door. A light flickered on in the kitchen. David heard the distinct, heavy clatter of a briefcase hitting the granite countertop. "David, I found the rest of the records," a weary voice called out. "I drove straight here, didn't stop." "We're going to be fine," it was Sarah. She had walked directly into the house. Unaware that the stone was destroyed, Alara was grounded, and her daughter now knew the truth. But Sarah hadn't entered alone. Stepping out of the shadows behind her, his face grim and set, was a man David recognized instantly, not from the courtroom, but from a photograph in the Tilden files, Mr. Miller, the absentee neighbor whose land Alara had been using, and who had refused to take David's calls for days. Miller was holding a final sealed envelope. "You should have let the water have its due, David," Miller said, his voice flat. He looked at Sarah, then back at David. "Because the second concession has a condition of its own, Thorne. My family has been watching this lake for 110 years. We weren't absentee." Miller tossed the envelope onto the floor. Silas Tilden's final notarized will. It states that the first child born on the land is the only person who can speak the counterclaim. But only I... The clatter of Sarah's briefcase on the granite counter had been the sound of normalcy crashing into chaos. She stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, her weary face lit by the dim light, staring from her wide-eyed husband, David, to the man who was not merely their neighbor, but their judge, Mr. Miller. Silas Tilden's final, notarized will, Miller repeated, his shadow falling across the floor. It states the first child born on the land can speak the counterclaim, but only if they are not adopted. Sarah's eyes flickered down to the envelope on the floor, then back to David, who was breathing in short, shallow gasps. "Adopted? David, what is he talking about? What happened? And where is Chloe?" He told her, Sarah. David croaked, the betrayal heavy and thick on his tongue. He told her everything. Her birth, the Tilden bloodline, the window. He forced her to say the name when the light died. Sarah's briefcase slid from her fingers, hitting the floor with a hollow thud. The paperwork she had spent 48 sleepless hours retrieving was useless. The counterclaim was null. The house was saved, only to be instantly lost to a final, inescapable legal loophole. "You knew," Sarah whispered, her focus shifting entirely to Miller. "You knew the adoption condition was in that will, and you let David force that secret out of her just to see us fail." Miller didn't flinch. "I let you fail for the same reason I let Alara fail, because you both believed the lake was something to be owned. My family, the Millers, we are the only ones who never filed a deed. We are the executors of Silas Tilden's intent, not his survey." Intent. David finally moved, stumbling towards Miller. "His intent was to save his land from lunatics. What is your intent, Miller? To take my house and my dock and leave me landlocked? What gives you the right to the shoreline?" Miller calmly picked up the will envelope. "Silas and my great-grandfather were friends. When Silas realized his deed was a lie and his family was cursed by the water, hence the dead son, Ember Tilden, he made a final agreement. He knew his daughter, Clementine, was planning to sell the property. He couldn't let the land be desecrated by modern development. He opened the envelope and pulled out a single, heavily notarized page. He willed the entire perimeter of the land, the area between the new iron pins and the water's actual high water mark, to my family, the Millers. The condition was simple. If ever a lawsuit challenged the Tilden deed based on the original, Submerged boundary, the Miller family must invoke this will. Buy the Thorn and Tilden lots at the original 1993 appraised value and return the entire shoreline to its natural, undeveloped state. The sheer, staggering scope of the betrayal hit David. Miller wasn't a vindictive neighbor. He was a silent, patient executioner of a century-old environmental protection order. "You are going to condemn our house," David whispered, defeated. "I am going to save the lake," Miller corrected. "The law says you own the house, David, but you no longer own the land that grants you access to the water. The Miller property now runs from your foundation to your neighbors and from the highway to the lake." Outside, chaos reigned on the shoreline. Ilara, trapped and furious on the stranded pontoon, was screaming into her phone while Anya Sharma frantically pulled their salvageable gear out of the mud. Ilara had just suffered the most public and humiliating defeat of her life, her mythical stone destroyed, her claim countered by what she thought was a blood relative, and her expensive vessel grounded in the muck. Suddenly, Ilara hung up, her face white with a fresh horror. She stared at the cabin, not at David, but at Miller, who was now visible in the kitchen light. She recognized the name Miller. Her own family research had hinted at the Millers' ancestral claims. She knew what this meant. The fight for the water had been a smokescreen. The real fight was for the dirt. "Sharma, forget the boat," Ilara shouted, scrambling off the pontoon. She rushed toward Miller's house, which now felt less like a neighbor's home and more like a fortress. "He can't do this. That land is zoned residential. We have rights." She arrived at the edge of the Thorn property, just as Miller stepped out onto the porch, the will tucked under his arm. "The zoning is void when the land reverts to the original pre-development agreement," Miller said calmly, already anticipating her challenge. "I'm filing the papers first thing in the morning. Your battle for the water has simply triggered the inevitable. Your family's claim was a failure. Mine is a success." Ilara's anger curdled into something cold and terrifying. "The lake gave you the land, but the land will never keep it. The one who spoke the name, the true heir, will never let you keep the land." At that moment, Chloe emerged from the cabin, her face pale but hardened with resolution. She carried her laptop and a small duffel bag. She walked past David and Sarah as if they were ghosts, her eyes fixed on Ilara. "I spoke the name," Chloe said, her voice clear and strong. "And the name didn't save the land. It only showed me who I am. You're Ilara, my biological aunt." Ilara turned, stunned, seeing the full, agonizing truth in Chloe's eyes. "The child. You're the child my mother gave up?" "I am," Chloe affirmed. "The one born on the land. My father used me to keep his house. My aunt used me to claim her water. But the land used us all to finally get what it wanted." Chloe walked up to Miller, looking at him, the self-proclaimed custodian. "You destroyed the only evidence of my birthright, the Emberstone, and you used my father's secret to execute your own ancestral agenda." "You won," Miller met her gaze. "It's justice, Chloe. The lake needs protection." "Justice for whom?" Chloe asked, her voice heavy with irony. She looked around, at the wrecked pontoon, at her weeping mother, at her defeated father, and at the man who had turned her entire world into a lie. She didn't look sad. She looked determined. "I came back for this," Chloe said, holding up her laptop. "I was applying for an internship. City planning. I want to build things. You want to turn this into a wildlife preserve, Miller? Fine. You want to buy my parents' house at below market value? Fine. But you don't dictate the future of this community." Chloe walked to the edge of the property line, her feet touching the gravel that was now Miller's. "You may own the shoreline, but I know all the zoning laws in the North Woods, and the moment my parents sell you their property, I will use every loophole, every variance, and every historical land trust available to ensure that this entire stretch of shoreline, including your plot, Miller, is designated as a regional heritage water access zone. You will not be able to develop it, sell it, or gate it. It will be the most used, most public stretch of water access in the county. You wanted to protect the lake? Fine. Now everyone gets to love it." Miller stared at her, his composure finally breaking, his face contorted in shock. "You can't do that. The The Tilden will is null and void because I'm adopted, Chloe finished for him. My actions today aren't governed by Silas Tilden's paranoia. They're governed by the Northwoods Community Planning Act of 2008. You may have won the land, Miller, but I am taking the water back for the people, and I will force you to become the public servant you never wanted to be. She turned to David and Sarah, her face softening with a devastating finality. I'm leaving. I can't stay here, not with the history, not with the lies. I'll call you. Chloe walked away from the cabin, leaving her parents and the three claimants, David, Alara, and Miller, trapped in the wreckage of their own ambitions. She did not look back at the house that was no longer hers. The final beat, karmic irony and justice. 6 months later, Ember Lake was quiet again. The Thorn cabin had been sold to Miller's estate at the low, appraised 1993 value. David and Sarah were back in the city, trying to rebuild their marriage and their relationship with Chloe, who refused to answer calls but sent postcards signed simply C. Thorn. The final, crushing irony, Miller, the silent custodian, had won the right to return the entire shoreline to its natural state. He had his silence and his solitude. But Chloe, in a series of brilliant, cold, and calculated legal moves leveraging her city planning knowledge, had filed the precise motions needed before the sale was finalized. The former Thorn property was now a mandatory public access point and conservation area on the day Miller was legally required to install the first new permanent public access pier. David and Sarah drove up to the lake. They found Miller standing on the old Thorn dock, which was now affixed with a massive engraved bronze plaque bearing the words, "The Chloe Thorn Community Pier." Miller was surrounded by trucks. He wasn't watching the lake. He was watching dozens of delighted families, hikers, swimmers, and fishermen descend onto the property he had fought so hard to keep private. She won, David, Miller said, his voice flat with final defeat. She used the land to claim the water for everyone. She is the true custodian. A small boat pulled up to the new public pier. In the captain's seat, smiling, was Alara. She had bought a new, inexpensive boat and was now legally entitled to launch it and navigate the entire lake from the pier located on what used to be David Thorn's property. Alara cut the engine, tied the line to the Chloe Thorn Community Pier, and stepped ashore onto Miller's land. She walked past Miller and stopped directly in front of David and Sarah. "The law says you own the land," Alara said, echoing her original words, but this time with a hint of genuine respect. "But your daughter proved that the water belongs to no one, and therefore it be.